I'm Bill Griffith. Good evening, everybody. I'm in for Tyler Matheson again tonight.
And I'm Susie Garib. Good evening from me as well. We begin tonight with General Motors and its widening safety crisis. The automaker stunned consumers and investors today, announcing another huge recall, and this one involves more fatalities. GM is recalling over 8 million vehicles, nearly all of them in the U.S., after defective parts have been linked to at least another 3 crash-related fatalities. Now, this brings the total number of recalls to 28 million vehicles worldwide just for this year. Now, on top of that, GM also said it would increase its second quarter charge to earnings to $1.2 billion to help pay for all those recalls. The surprising news came on the same day that GM laid out its plan to compensate survivors and the families of another 13 people who were killed in crashes related to those faulty switches. Investors sold on the news. GM shares fell nearly 1%. Joining us now to talk about all of this, our own Phil LeBeau, who has been covering the GM crisis right from day one, and also with us, Colin Langan. He's an auto analyst at UBS. So, Phil, let me begin with you. You know, just a few weeks ago, CEO of GM, Mary Barra, was saying that she thought that they were coming towards the end of this whole recall crisis. And now this, and this is a big one. So what does this mean for her credibility? But also, more importantly, what does this mean for the credibility of General Motors?
Well, it means that they're clearly not anywhere close to establishing that they have cleared out all the potential cases related to ignitions, related to other quality problems. And ultimately, what this does is it calls into question the quality control at General Motors. Now, this may be the last massive recall, Susie, but at some point, people are going to say, when does it end? And there's no way of predicting that, as we know from today's recalls.
What do you think about that, Colin? When do you think it ends? And what about the price tag they're putting on it so far? Could those charges that they're taking against earnings go even higher, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the company earlier this month indicated that by the end of Q2, they'd have a better grip on the recall situation. Today is the end of Q2, so I think there's a very logical time here for the announcement. So to some degree, it's not too surprising. I think the size of the charge is a bit larger than many people had anticipated. Obviously, it could go up, but based on the comments from the company earlier this month, they basically said it would take them to the end of this quarter to kind of get through the pipeline of potential issues. And so I do think that it's going to be materially lower from here on out.
You know, Colin, you must still be feeling pretty good about General Motors, because I saw your latest report today, and you're still confirming your buy on GM stock. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, once you get these recall issues behind the company, the valuation here is very compelling. I think if you go into the second half of the year, you'll have a pretty good market share story as they ramp up production of their new pickup trucks. And I do think, getting the recall behind is a key event. So the Victims' Compensation Fund announcement, hopefully this will be the final major recall announcement that we see from GM, are pretty good positive events in terms of getting it past the company and moving on to, moving forward for the company.
Phil, I want to be careful how I word this question, because obviously safety is very important, and especially to GM right now. But they've recalled, what, 28 million cars so far this year. Are we to the point now where maybe they're overdoing it?
Well, there's no doubt that when you look at the 54 recalls from General Motors this year, a number of them are very ticky-tack minor things that ordinarily would have been handled with the service bulletin, shouldn't be part of a recall. However, there are a number of substantial recalls amongst those 28 million that involve potentially deadly defects, or in some cases are deadly defects. So you have to be careful about how you look at it. It's a huge number, Bill. There's no doubt about that. Anytime you have a company recalling 28 million vehicles, it's going to get a lot of attention. But there are some in these recalls that are clearly initiated because the federal government's looking at them so closely.
And speaking of the federal government, Colin, let me go to you. We've been talking about red flags for GM. The government is still investigating for any criminality at General Motors. If there are any criminal charges brought against General Motors itself or of any of its employees, how would you react to that? Will that change your view on General Motors, the company, and the stock?
To be honest, we already anticipate that there'll probably be a criminal penalty. If you look at the Toyota recall, there was about a $1.2 billion penalty. That'll probably take several years to come to that final settlement, but I actually think it is likely, and we should anticipate something in the future.
All right, gentlemen, stay right there. We have more to talk about here. As we mentioned earlier, General Motors gave more detail today on how it plans to pay millions of dollars to settle those ignition switch cases. But for some, the automaker's offer may not be enough. More Phil LeBeau. He's talked to the man in charge of the compensation fund. Watch.
Attorney Ken Feinberg admits money is no substitute for a life that's been lost or tragically altered by a crash involving a defective GM vehicle. Still, he's putting a price on how much the automaker will pay victims for their pain and suffering.
What did the individual victim, whether it's a death claim or a physical injury claim, what would that person have made over a lifetime but for this horrible accident? What about non-economic pain and suffering? The individual cases vary from case to case to case.
Feinberg says there will be no cap on settlement awards, though the families of those killed in defective GM models will get at least $1 million. Those injured could get at least $20,000, with claims paid out in 90 to 180 days, depending on the complexity of the case.
I took the best I could from everybody's submission to me, and this protocol is mine and mine alone.
Feinberg met with the families of 2 victims after announcing the compensation fund. The birth mother of a 16-year-old killed in a 2005 Chevy Cobalt says she'll likely pass on the payout from the fund and instead sue GM for punitive damages that could be costlier for the automaker.
You know, if dollars and cents is what GM is focused on before and may be focused on again in the future, you know, that would send a message never ever to do this again to anyone else.
GM says the fund shows it's taking responsibility for at least 13 deaths linked with faulty ignition switches. But attorneys suing GM say it doesn't go far enough.
You have a significant punitive component here. In other words, not only is GM at fault for what happened with these victims, but there could be punitive damages awarded because of the egregious nature of their conduct.
The GM Victim Fund will start processing claims on August 1st. And by the end of the year, General Motors is hoping that the fund will help resolve 90% of the cases involving people who were killed or injured in defective GM cars.
Phil, I mean, this is could be a quagmire, but if anybody
Right.
can do it, it's Ken Feinberg. He's made a whole career of dealing with these Herculean funds, hasn't he?
And he set out some parameters here in which he basically said, look, I'm going to give you some examples of different potential victims and what they might get, whether it's 2.2 million, 5.5 million, whatever it might be. But General Motors is optimistic that when you look at Ken Feinberg's track record, in the past, when he's done this, whether it's with BP or 9/11, about 90% of the potential cases are resolved this way. And that's what General Motors is banking on. They would love to clear up most of these cases this way and avoid the uncertainty and the cost of going to court.
Colin, what do you think about that? I'm sure you've been running numbers and doing your analysis on the potential liability for General Motors. And Ken Feinberg sounds like he really wants to be fair about all of this, but this could really go to court and end up with a lot of money. Is that how you see it? What are your numbers telling you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing you have to realize is that GM does have bankruptcy protection for many of these claims. So that's something I think the victims are going to have to consider if they do go to court, because their chances, they're going to have to prove that senior management at GM, was deceptive in the bankruptcy, and I think that may be a hard claim. So, I think there's a good chance that we'll settle a lot of this out. When I look at it, we're estimating in our numbers that there'll be about a $300 million cost to GM. That's about a third the size of the civil settlement that Toyota incurred with their recall, and they're actually about a third the number of vehicles on a relative basis specific to the ignition recall issue.
Colin, before we let you go, this is a horrible situation that they face, and it's very, very expensive, obviously. Are you surprised the stock hasn't fallen more than it has, and what do you think of it right now?
I mean, I think that, today it's down, less than 1% on some pretty bad news. I think it gives a sense of how low sentiment is in the name, which, from my perspective, is the buying opportunity here for investors. Obviously, a lot of negative news is priced in. I think the company and senior management is handling it as best as they can and trying to be transparent. And I do think as we head into the second half of the year, there's clearly some upside to the stock as they kind of get past this issue.
Colin Langan from UBS, thank you. Phil LeBeau, as always, thank you. Thank you both for joining us.